Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to be doing a full spoiler review and discussion of Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson, the fifth book in the Stormlight Archive, the conclusion of the first arc of what many consider to be the best epic fantasy, high fantasy series of the last few decades. I would be included among that number. Stormlight was my first introduction to Brandon Sanderson's writing, and The Way of Kings will always have a special place in my heart. And the fact that he was able to come back after that and produce books that I would say, and I think many would agree, are even better, says volumes. Now, like I said, this is going to be a full spoiler discussion, not only of the Stormlight Archive, but of the Cosmere as a whole. I'm going to talk about everything, all the interconnections, all the things that I noticed, the things that jumped out at me, as well as my thoughts on the ending and where this could potentially go. This book had, I think, a lot of expectations put on it. And do I necessarily think it lived up to all the hype 100%? Maybe, maybe not. Definitely something I'm going to be discussing here, getting into sort of my thoughts on sort of how things rounded out for this first arc, and then looking towards the greater Cosmere, where things might go from here. If you enjoy this kind of content, if you're a fan of Brandon Sanderson's work, of sci-fi and fantasy, it might be worth hitting that like and subscribe button. I'm definitely going to be doing more discussions of this nature as more books in the Cosmere comes out. And if you're new to the Cosmere and jumping into this going, wait a second, hang on, back up a second, maybe I shouldn't be watching this video, I do have a full introductory video sort of going over everything you need to know before you start reading the Cosmere. So maybe go check that out instead. All right, let's talk about it. Wind and Truth, many years in the making, this like 1,400 page behemoth. I'm definitely not the first one to get this video out by any means. It took me a little bit longer to read, and as you can hear, I am maybe a little bit under the weather. I did have some work trips and travel and event stuff that I had to go do, but over the course of that, I was able to finish reading it. And my initial impressions are that, yeah, it was a solid finish to the series. And I think, candidly, Sanderson set himself kind of an impossible task. He said in an interview, I think it was one of his blogs, or vlogs, I should say, sort of roundup videos, that he originally had three versions of this ending. He basically shipped out those three versions of the ending to his various beta readers, and they all kind of came back with things that didn't work. And in the end, he ended up coming up with a finale that was a combination of all three of them. I would be really curious to know what those three iterations of this finish were, because I honestly don't know, for me, if it did enough. I know this is the end of a first arc, and that there's going to be more from here. We know there's going to be a time skip, I think, the 40 to 50 year range. But now, knowing what we know about the time dilation elements, I'm kind of still surprised by how this finished. I'll be honest, again, this didn't really feel like it finished anything. I was kind of hoping to put more of a bow on this first arc. I was kind of hoping to wrap up more loose ends, because we still have so many loose ends. What the heck? I mean, we never got the final epic confrontation with Moash. Brock is still on a mountain somewhere. Is he even still alive? We have no idea. There are still so many small things that I don't necessarily feel like hit the mark. It sucks, because so much of this book was so fantastic. Now, I think this book, kind of due to the nature of the time it sort of takes place, the time scaling, it sort of had like this like anti-pacing issue. Like right off the rip, there's only 10 days left at this nice sort of 200-page cushion at the start. Sort of felt kind of good. Kaladin is sort of pushed through his wave, the last wave of depression that really hung over him in Rhythm of War, and it's candidly the thing that made Rhythm of War for me really hard to read. We sort of had that really nice opening. We sort of set the stage, set up where the characters are going, and then we got into it. But the thing is sort of when we got into it at that point, we almost kind of fell into Sanderlanche territory really early, like surprisingly early. So many of these chapters, of course, each one sort of being a day, has so much head hopping that happens. I mean, we have 7 or 8 POVs in a single chapter, not including any of the interludes. And sometimes I found myself having to go back a page, and maybe it wasn't quite the case for the audiobook listeners, but found myself having to go back again and going, wait a second, do we swap POVs? Oh yeah, I missed those three little stars that at the bottom of the page or whatever that sort of indicated that we're swapping again. And we would go through it so quickly, like even sometimes only a handful of pages for a single character. That was normally something that, at least in my mind, was reserved for the end of the book, Sanderlanche POV scenario. Now, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing because there's so many things that were going on, and you're like, there wasn't necessarily any sort of, character perspective that I really didn't want to see. But part of the problem was by hitting us so hard right off the bat, at least for me a little bit, it almost sort of had this element of fatigue because, I'm thinking, we're in Azir or whatever, and at any moment, the Oathgate could be overwhelmed and, suddenly it could be overrun, and any given moment, like something horrible could, happen in Shinovar or with Shallan. And, because there's sort of so much high pressure all the time, at least for me a little bit, the fatigue hit just a smidge. Now, again, I don't think any of the particular storylines were poorly executed. I love the character development a lot of these characters got over the course of this. I think Shallan and Adolin were really, honestly, the real standouts for me in that regard. I think Kaladin kind of rightfully got his sort of main progression over the course of the last book in Rhythm of War, and I really, really appreciate, especially, I mean, Adolin was always a character that I really enjoyed, but he might have actually been my favorite character in this book. Sort of seeing him, sort of raising up or befriending this young emperor, and seeing the dynamic there and the way he sort of came in, and even this little section about remembering names, little stuff like that, things that you don't necessarily think about, but the fact that those little elements were given the time to even be addressed or discussed in this. But that was one thing that definitely jumped out at me with so many of these different characters. Sanderson has gotten so many compliments of having such good representation in his books, especially for things like, folks who are on the spectrum. When we look at, with Mistborn especially, we see characters there that are sort of represent that. We see, again, characters dealing with depression and just, dissociative disorder and that kind of stuff with Shallan. And obviously a lot of work's been put into that, but it almost sort of felt like every single person needed to sort of have that moment where you're like, yes, this is their thing, and this is what they're struggling to overcome, and this is what their journey is going to be like. It almost felt like, especially near the start of the book, every single person sort of introduced, here's the thing they're struggling with, and here we go on to the next person. And it was just almost like, okay, wow, like it was just sort of the way it was laid out. It was almost like it was a menu. It was like, yeah, cool, and this one, and this one, and this one, and this one. And it almost kind of, like, again, I love and appreciate the fact that we have this representation here, but it almost felt, candidly, just a little heavy-handed. It was kind of odd. It was almost just like everything is just laid out so plainly, but there were certain elements of it for sure that just sort of felt like they were trying to hit you over the head. And I do think that, there's certain moments in this book that he was trying so desperately hard to emulate the moments that he had in past books. The honor is dead, but I'll see what I can do. Literally repeating that line again in this book was interesting. And I think he was so constantly searching for it. I mean, we've, the trending, sound on TikTok, Zeth, son Volano, truthless of Shinovar, wore white on the day he was to kill a king. Like, epic lines. I love it. But at the same time, they were epic not because they were forced, but because they felt organic and natural. And having this Judge Dredd scream moment from Zeth of "I am the law" just was like, really? After all this about hearing the ascent, not even just bypassing the fourth ideal completely, just going right to the fifth, and just after all that, just being "I am the law." And yes, we got the nice little sort of sprinkle on top of, oh, what does this actually mean? And the idea of, making our own choices. But it just felt, I don't know, it just felt a little bit forced. And, I love the fact that we got so many fun reveals over the course of this book. I love the idea that the Stormfather was originally potentially going to pair with Gavilar at the start of all this. And at the end, it always comes back to Gavilar. That at the start of all of these different books, we have it come back to Gavilar and the work that he had originally done. That to me was so cool, and I think really helped contextualize the Stormfather context. That when we come back to the end and we realize there is truly still a shard of honor within him, and that sort of imprint of honor's mind, when realizing that this whole time, yes, honor is dead, but functionally living as a cognitive shadow within the Stormfather just gives so much more context. The idea that he can lie and has lied repeatedly, the fact that he's ashamed. Oh, just so very cool. And again, the fact that, that opening moments, the start where you're like, that Seon was not actually what we thought. It was actually working for Kelsier this whole time. And with Felt and the whole betrayal, like right off the rip, there were so many just like revelations at the start of the book that helped set things up that I thought were so cool. And I really did appreciate the dynamic with Yatil and Mraize and Shallan. And I love the idea that there was a more of a consistent off-world presence here. And I like the fact that, candidly, like, Sanderson's saying, like, you need to have read the rest of these books. I love the fact that he's not afraid to commit to the harder, broader Cosmere references. And it was so cool to see this set up for Zigzil, knowing where he ends up, seeing those moments there with his initial Spren, seeing him meet the High Spren at the end again, 21241, whatever his name ends up, I can't remember. But having those moments felt really, really cool. Which made the final moments of this book, I think, hit that little bit less. I mean, you spend, maybe the back third of this book, I would say, if there was any section that sort of struggled with pacing, I would say it was the section in the spiritual realm. All the sections with Adolin I loved. All the moments in Shinovar, Seth's backstory, I really enjoyed. Anytime you have a flashback sequence, a prolonged flashback sequence, and I'm excited to keep reading it, that's how you know it's a success. And I'll go back to Seth in a bit, because I think that's worth talking about. But the moments in the spiritual realm, for Dalinar specifically, I loved the dynamic with R'Lain and Renarin and their sort of coming into their own as their individuals and learning about R'Lain's backstory, especially because I think, for a lot of us, this idea that, people just let him go, the whole let him, I mean, that of all the moments in the book that kind of hit, at least for me, that moment where it's like, yeah, your friends don't really miss you and you can go, that's fine. That nobody really cares enough to ask you to stay. Like, ooh, that was a gut punch for sure. That one really stood out to me. And then having that sort of, dynamic with R'Lain and Renarin to set up the idea that they could release Boed Mishram, like that was such a fun, again, so many great arcs, so many characters had great. Shallan's arc and the reveal that yes, the idea that the sentence that is like, I think the first line of her first POV in Way of Kings, the world ended and Shallan was to blame. The fact that was fully paid off again, that was a pretty well-known and explored fan theory, the idea that when she killed her mother, she started the next desolation. And the fact that Tal never broke. Yes, Tal, my boy, never broke. Love that so much. Oh my goodness. I mean, it's so exciting. We have that when we have his pop-off moment and he just like almost single-handedly rips through like 200 Parshendi, 200 singers. Ooh. And Regals and like dire forms and stuff. Like, let's go. So cool. I'm gonna keep talking, but as you can hear my voice starting to go. We'll go back to Szeth, because I think his whole situation was great, because we really never got much of his backstory. I mean, I honestly assumed, I think a lot of people did, that sort of his skills as an assassin were more honed while he was an assassin. Like, I considered Shinovar to be like a total backwater. Obviously, still that last bastion of humanity, as humanity was it was, coming in from off-world. But I really didn't appreciate just how badass he was beforehand. The idea that he trained with all the honor blades. The fact that all of this process, his time being truthless, was functionally just a really long and over-the-top job interview. If that doesn't feel millennial, I don't know what else does. That's ridiculous. The man was way overqualified to be a herald, especially when we saw how the heralds were before. Like, come on. Szeth was way overqualified for the position. And then the idea that after all that, they set this up and it felt wrong. So when that was sort of usurped and Kaladin stepped in the moment, did that feel right? I guess, yes. And the idea that, him swearing the fifth ideal is the idea that he can choose when to protect himself and when to protect others. Then as long as it's his choice, that protection is still good and valid. And I think a lot of folks sort of played around with the idea that there's a couple of different things that were going to happen that in terms of fan theories, that Dalinar was going to absorb honor and odium and become war. I know that was a really common fan theory that, as a son of honor, that Kaladin would step in and hold that. And I thought that was actually a possibility too when we talked about the idea of opening up a portal. And when Dalinar gave up honor, I thought maybe Kaladin was going to be ported in as a herald of the wind, or sort of champion of the wind, and pick up honor there in that moment, and all this, all this different stuff. I knew something was going to happen with Gavinor when he was brought into the spiritual realm in the first place. The whole reveal that he was actually the champion. I don't know. It didn't hit quite as well as I was expecting, to be honest. And the fact that after all that time spent in the spiritual realm, that Dalinar just kind of walks up there and wings it still. Because in the moment, obviously it's the accumulated knowledge that he needed. It was the idea that he sort of, the longer the time that unbonded honor sat in the spiritual realm, sort of absorbing all of the information and emotions and everything from humanity and the singers and the spren, the idea that it can grow and change is very cool and has very broad spanning Cosmere implications. But the idea that the trump card in the end was just to give it up and to break oaths after all this. Is it a cop-out? Is it a big brain move? I honestly don't know. It definitely didn't feel rewarding. Not as rewarding as I guess I would have liked. And again, yes, this is the first arc, and not everything needs to be tied up quite so perfectly. But I do wish that a few more loose ends might have been wrapped up a little bit. And yes, now obviously things have changed. It's like the Dark Tower, things that this cycle through, things are different. This is going to be truly the last desolation. The idea that therapist Kaladin can go through and spend time in the spiritual realm with the heralds and sort of help them mentally repair and rally and recover. But the reality is, Roshar is effed. Roshar has messed. No more Stormlight functionally broke the planet. I mean, it's not the first time that a shard has broke the planet or a combination thereof, but we know it's going to be years, decades probably, until it's sorted out. And most of the world sort of living under the thumb or, ignoring of odium. But the thing that really jumped out at me, and the thing I wonder if other people sort of caught, was when he sort of saved his home city, when he brought everyone into the spiritual realm, how much that actually defies odium. And we saw constantly from Honor's flashbacks the idea that every single time he went against the power of the shard, it weakened him significantly. It did demonstrably take away power. So is that one big decision to save Kharbranth, is that going to have longer spanning Cosmere implications? And again, my voice is going, but I want to talk about this. I talk about the Cosmere implications. We now are set up in a situation where there are sort of three big bads of the Cosmere. We have Harmony, who is descending into discord. We have Autonomy, who is reaching out everywhere, trying to assert themselves. And now we have Retribution. Retribution, who has a lot of eyes on them, yes. And that's the big brain play that Dalinar came up with. Make them so much of a threat that the other shards come into play. But we need good to fight against this, if not evil, at least bad. So obviously Cultivation took off to seek allies. And we heard Hoid talk about seeking out valor. And we also now have time context, because you see him at the end of the book heading in to become Hoid as we see him in the second half of Mistborn as part of the Ledrian household. So now we have some time context on that as well. So who are we going to rally behind? Who is it going to be? Can we save Harmony before they descend into discord? Is Valor going to step up? Is Whimsy going to make an appearance? I'm really curious as to what you all think. Who is going to be, is it Cultivation? Who is going to be the champion shard, or any, to rally here? Or is it going to be evil taking out evil? Or at least imbalance taking out imbalance? And does unite them extend to more than just humans, more than just singers, more than just nations and races, more than the Spren, more than honor and odium? And does unite them harken all the way back to recreating Adonalsium? And is that where this eventual thing is going? Because obviously, Hoyd's aspirations are bringing someone back from the dead. That's been hinted at so many times. We know throughout that he had someone that he loved to bring back. That's his eventual end goal. As much as saving the Cosmere, as much as the Dawn Shards are in play, we know he's got other motivations. But is there now, beyond Retribution's desire to bring everything back together, is that really possibly the best outcome? But with a different bearer of all of those vessels. How is that going to work? I'm very curious. I'm curious as to what you all thought. Did you think this had a satisfying enough ending? What do you think about the loose ends that are set up for the second half of this, which we won't see for a decade? Did this do enough to really put I wanted these 5 books to have a more concrete end. I would have been fine if there were hundreds of years, but between them. But it doesn't sound like there's going to be. Just hearing different stuff in terms of who's going to be. I mean, Yasna had just such a just such a sad little ending. Messes up and that's it. Breaks up with Wit and ta-da, you're like such a cool and amazing character who I don't think was well enough utilized near the end of this. And yes, people are allowed to fail. And yes, that can be part of character growth. And yes, still an interesting character. But the fact that when you have a character who's been such a key integral part of so many of these books, to have their only contribution to this book be to fail. When we're not coming back for like a decade. Overall, I was still really, so many parts of this book were so exciting. I loved the different characters, all the different characters that we got to see. I did like the sort of wrap up that we got, but again, Dalinar going out with a whimper, knowing we're going to see the Blackthorn as some sort of weird cognitive shadow imprint thing. And after all that, just sort of wings it. The one probability we never saw. Sure, not expecting. And it wasn't a happy or a sad ending, and I think that's fine. It's not all about a happy ending, but it's just about resolution. And there's a lot to still resolve with this. So yeah, again, I'm curious as to what you all think. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments down below. And again, if you enjoy this kind of content, be sure to like and subscribe. I swear I'll sound better for the next one. I swear I will. Okay. Thank you all so much, and I will see you next time. Cheers.